You were a bit slow. I wouldn't. I got slow.
Minutes behind this spot.
Yeah, that one.
I mean, it's just kind of.
My watch is a minute fast.
Keeps you on time. Everything running?
Yes, we're good.
Mine was showing 9 o'clock.
Yeah.
All the land.
Go by this computer, it has to.
For July 11th to order. Notice has been posted in accordance with Wisconsin statute 19.84 open meeting law. If there are any public comments at this time? We don't have any, no public comments. Approval of the agenda order. Move to approve. Motion by Mr. Anderson. Second. Mr. Gutsy. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Carried. Approval of minutes from June 6th, 2023 meeting.
Motion to approve the minutes.
Second motion.
Second.
Discussion. And this is a minor thing. But I've been reading through the minutes. I'm not completely sure if we should say that the motion regarding the whitetails was denied, if the motion to approve failed. And the result is that, it did not pass, but I don't know if it isn't a affirmative motion to deny either. Well, it's a hair splitting argument, I completely admit. But I'm not totally sure if that's the right verbiage, but I don't know that I would change it. Just want to point that out, I guess.
I asked the same question. One was just that she'd fix it.
Well, if we want to change it, I would simply say motion failed. To be effectively denied or something like that, but I would note that it failed rather than denied.
Who's our parliamentarian?
I'm the closest you're gonna get. Right now.
Sounds reasonable to me.
The minutes aren't, we've been had enough court cases here recently for us to know the minutes isn't the only item they put in the record. So they'd have the audio file, the video file, and they'd be able to
I don't know that I would even change it. I just would say that point of reference just for all of us to think about a little bit. We can maybe ask somebody more precisely, But I didn't bring that up to change it. I only brought it up to discuss
Next time.
that was the right wording or not.
I listened to the tape and I did say it denies.
Then we'll go with what you said.
Well, that was what,
I'm good with that.
that's what we said at the day of the meeting. So I said,
Yeah, let's call the question.
that was what I asked. That's why I asked. Because originally it said denied. And one that said that she would correct it, so more positive, I guess. Okay. Anybody wish to change minutes or not?
No,
Corrections?
I'm not.
So as written.
Yes.
Okay.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, carried. Next, discuss the electrical vehicle charging infrastructure policy.
So today with us, we have Bridget and John from WSB who are gonna lead a discussion about charging infrastructure policy.
Before we jump into it, I perhaps should just provide a little more context. So this project really came about as part of our public safety facility project. And as you folks are aware, we are putting some conduit in the ground to be able to facilitate the expansion of this particular EV charging stations at some point in the future. And so as part of the project, we started working with WSB several months ago to explore and look at ways that we could start to have a policy in place that we could then bring to the committee like we are this morning to start the conversation so that we can bring all 21 board members along over the course of the next year. We know it's going to take multiple conversations, not only with this particular committee and some of the aspects that are identified in it today, but certainly with infrastructure committee. We're going to be going through those folks and through that committee within the next few months here, and then ultimately administration committee as well. So at this point in time, we'll turn it over to the folks from WSB to just bring you up to speed on where we're at today from some conversations with staff. Gary Fopp has been involved, including myself and Jason. And I believe he is going to be here this morning. He's pretty ramped up about it and pretty excited about it, but he's been doing a lot of his own research and trying to figure out what we could do here as well from a local government perspective. But with that, I'll turn it over to these two.
Well, good morning. I should probably state my name for the record and everything. Bridget Ratzak with WSB.
John Bradford with WSB.
So it's great to be here this morning, and actually a fun anecdote is that I just bought an EV and I drove it up here. So thank you for having us today and a lovely drive this morning. But I know there's just a lot of information about electric vehicles or EVs out there, and I'm hoping today we can just get started talking about it, and I can hear from you, what your questions are, where we can help, because as you dive into this, there's so many different factors, and this technology is evolving so quickly that sometimes the answer is really, there are multiple answers to a lot of questions you might ask or might have about this. So, occasionally it's kind of like a if then situation, because every electric vehicle is a little different. There are multiple levels of charging and things like that. But I think really with this policy, the goal is to really have a balanced measure approach so that the county can be planful as electric vehicles start coming into the county, and as visitors and residents purchase electric vehicles, and as the county considers purchasing electric vehicles. So this really doesn't commit you all to anything. It's to get set up so that you have a plan, and you don't wind up with a charger in the right of way where you don't want it or something like that. So that's just an example I pick on. We decided not to put any on the right of way in the county because it just didn't make sense. But I like to pick on that one because we were just talking about snow plowing and maintenance issues when you think about chargers in the right of way, and that snow just getting piled up right there, creating basically a wall of ice.
A good way to think about it is before people start clamoring to install their own EV chargers, what is the county roadmap for doing that in a way that makes sense and is a benefit to the county and its residents?
Yes. And kind of in the background of purpose, we talked a little bit about your goals in the county and which goals that this kind of aligns with in your policy. So I know one thing that I talked to Gary a lot about too was just around striving for cost-effective, clean, orderly, and safe conditions. So electric vehicles can save money over the course of their lifetime, just with the reduced amount of maintenance costs that occur, right? There's no oil changes, there's no oil to change in an electric vehicle. So you can see reduced costs, particularly if you're on, if you can get some beneficial utility provided rates as well. So with that being said, I kind of want to just start by just asking you all if you have any questions or if anything popped up as you were perusing this material before the meeting today that we can just start with, because I know sometimes people want to just hear about, the evolution of electric vehicles, what you're seeing in Wisconsin and in the county, things like that. So I'll pause for a moment before jumping into a little bit more on the policy.
I have a question. My grandson has it is a pure bread or whatever it is. But I asked him, I says, how do people pay for the charging use? And he says his license plate, he has to pay more for his license plate than he would for normal card. You know what the
Yeah, that's a lot.
difference is?
A lot of states will do that, because you won't pay the gas tax. So,
I can weigh in. My wife actually has a Toyota RAV4 hybrid, so it's
Yeah.
gas and electric. And it's we have to pay 160 for license plate versus I think a car is 80 or something in Wisconsin, 85. So that's the only difference we pay with our, slash hybrid.
yeah, and I think that's for some of the roadway funding, because you don't get the gas taxes, or you don't pay gas taxes if you aren't buying gasoline anymore. So that's state by state, so states are kind of doing that differently across the country, depending on the
In that
models.
same vein, if we were to have charging stations here that were public accessible, which would probably be necessary in a public facility, of course. How do the people who are using that pay for that? Is it just like a card or?
So, yeah, that's a great question. Actually depends. A lot of it you can do on your phone. I have 5 different charging apps that I have on my phone. I've never done it admittedly, because I just drive my car locally a lot. And we take our hybrid vehicle on longer trips admittedly yet. But you can do it on an app. Some of the apps actually give you like a little credit card kind of thing that you can just keep in the car. And there are a couple of different providers, and then some you simply can just, what I would probably recommend is one that has a credit card reader. So you don't have to, if your signal is not very good, or, you don't have a smartphone, you can still pay with a credit card, because it does favor, the smartphones and all of that.
We could have Luddites with electric vehicles here, so, we have to be accommodating to that.
Well, and to sort of add a level of complexity to it, I was working for the city of Bloomington and installed EV chargers. And we found that initially, before we had a huge demand of public electric vehicles, that we actually saved money by not installing the charging software because of all of the license expenditures to
Do the billing.
to do the billing for it, that for the first few years, we just didn't charge people for electricity because there was so little electrical use from the public on those chargers.
Mhm.
Now, when that demand increases at some tipping point, we would turn on the billing.
Yeah, that's how I think a lot of cities have approached it, and counties too, just when there's that. And sometimes, I think in different cases, you might install the electric vehicle charger first for a fleet vehicle. So if the county is interested in getting their, first fleet vehicle, I was just telling John on the way up here about Eden Prairie has actually gotten Teslas for police vehicles. And especially during kind of the volatile last couple of years we've had with gasoline prices, has seen a 30% cost savings just in the last year with that vehicle. And they're doing it as a pilot. So they're working very closely with their police force, obviously, to make sure everything's going to be working right and it meets the needs of the officers. But that is, they probably installed their, chargers separately for those fleet vehicles as well. So that might be another approach to think about. In the policy, I write a little bit later on about how you have parking rules and restrictions that change over time. And I think for electric vehicle charging parking spots, that could also be a consideration where perhaps you put one in that's, for the fleet and for the public. If you don't get a lot of use on the public side, and then at some point, maybe you say, from 5 p.m. to 8 a.m., it's only for county fleet vehicles. But during the day, when those fleet vehicles are out and about, maybe you have it open to the public. So there are some interesting things you can toy around with, and that continues to evolve, and staff will be probably looking at that as that continues, if you would put one in perhaps here or elsewhere in the county.
As a former fireman, back when I was still fireman, we had to go through training because of electric vehicles. But how are they disposing of the so-called battery for these electric vehicles? Because you can't just put them in a landfill. So.
Yes, so there is recycling with some of that, with all the lithium ion and things like that in the batteries. I will say that's an evolving industry. And since there are so many precious metals in there that are quite costly to mine and also have faced some serious supply chain issues. I think just like, cell phones do the take back programs and things like that. We're seeing a lot more of that. Since we're pretty early in the electric vehicle development, we haven't seen as much of that just because they're kind of getting out the door at this point. But like with solar panels too, the same thing is starting to happen where they're doing kind of that take back program. They're pulling apart the components and then reusing what they can and then recycling or disposing of them appropriately or as well as they can. I know there's a lot of work going on with the federal government infrastructure funding too, to look for ways to better utilize those materials, their second life or, to keep them in the circular loop so that they can continue to be used over and over and over again. I know I just do that in my personal life, right? Like I have a Folgers coffee thing that I then use for storage and, I try not to throw everything away or try to dispose of it and try to reuse. So yeah, that's an evolving space. I thought you were gonna ask about fire risks. So you threw me for a loop on that question.
Yeah, what about the fire risks?
There certainly are. I have had some really interesting conversations with a couple fire chiefs just in the last month, actually. And certainly the fire department needs to be heavily involved as to where to place the chargers, I think, particularly if you have any hazardous materials on site. We were actually just talking to the airport and they were talking a little bit about, where to site their chargers, knowing that there is a lot of hazardous material in those areas. So certainly I would say consider that and think about, how a fire crew would access the vehicle and make sure there's enough space around it, things like that. Because electric vehicles actually have a much lower risk of fire, but when they do start on fire, they're much more detrimental and they're hard to put out because of the battery. So typically what fire crews do is they try to damper it as much as possible until it kind of burns itself out. So should you have any parking structures or ramps or anything like that, that would be really where you'd have, some significant discussions with the fire crews. But if it's, outdoor open air parking lot, you just have a lot more space and air to work with so that you don't smoke out an entire building or complex or something like that too. So there certainly are risks, but the National Fire Code and all of that is currently working on catching up with some of that. So from my standpoint, putting my hat on of all the cities and counties I've worked with is just to talk with your fire crews, ensure that they feel comfortable with where those EVs could be parked, should there be an emergency that they need to address. And again, that risk is fairly low compared to regular combustion engines, or even actually hybrids have like the highest fire risk, which is fascinating, but also, they use these numbers directionally because there are so many, regular internal combustion vehicles as compared to hybrids and electric vehicles. So the percentages could be skewed just because the numbers are so much different. But again, it's kind of one of those risks that we've accepted because a lot of us have vehicles and drive them around. And so just managing that risk, I think, is the most important part to ensure that safety and all of that is addressed and considered so that there's no damage to the buildings or nearby structures or even trees. Maybe they're worried about trees, don't plant trees right over those EV chargers as well. I set myself up for that question.
Back in the day, we were taught to use foam, but now with the problems with foam, I don't imagine they say to use that anymore either.
Yeah, that's beyond my knowledge, but I know there's been a lot of discussion around the chemicals used in firefighting.
Yeah.
Any other top of mind questions? Otherwise, we can maybe jump into some of the sections of the policy to kind of bring to life what we've been talking with staff about thus far. Right. Okay, so I think everybody has this on their iPads and or hopefully.
I have hard copies if you want hard copies.
I know, me too. I got my highlights and. For my mention of first.
Yes.
Hey, I do.
There's the policy. Policy. You're good?
So I think everybody's got it. So I'm gonna start with the bigger document. So I think we got like 13 pages. That one, because the cover letter kind of just tells us what's all in here. So I'll kind of review this 11-page document. So how it's set up just generally is background and purpose, and then you really dive into the policy. And then towards the end, we talk about like how you're going to refresh and review this policy over time. So those are the big sections. And then in the appendix, I also have a few interesting, what I think are interesting facts and tidbits about electric vehicles with more information towards the end. So that's kind of our key sections here of the policy. And the upfront background and purpose really talks a lot about your mission and vision with the county. And how this policy works in. So really with this, we're looking to help, obviously, spur economic development in the county, knowing, you have a lot of tourism here and things like that. And that visitors are coming here and residents that are living here are moving around in the county. And so how can you support that? Also, there are some interesting studies just about the amount of jobs that can be created with the installation of some of these chargers. Which hopefully those jobs could be supplied in the county, right? Or possibly in an adjacent county, looking at your residents and businesses here. My father is a retired electrician, actually, so I always get excited about these sorts of things because he was kind of getting pushed out of his last job. They're closing down and moving overseas at his factory. So thinking about job potential for people in the trades and things like that to put this in is super important. So economic development is kind of a multifaceted bullet point statement there. The second thing we're looking at is how do we prepare for future county-owned electric vehicles, which can save money over the course of their lifetime, which I know I mentioned earlier. Also, by switching to electric vehicles instead of internal combustion engines, we can see a reduction in air emissions locally that can benefit the county and residents. Particularly, if you live by a highway, there's higher amounts of some of those toxic pollutants in the air. And then lastly, thinking about how we prepare for grant funding or utility partnership programs coming. So there's been a lot of grant funding coming out of the federal government for electric vehicle charging. A lot of it is right now is focused on kind of those main highway corridors. And then also kind of patching the holes in between. So when you look at different mapping tools, you can see where people might have a charging desert, it's called, quote unquote, where they don't have access to charging. But saying that, too, a lot of charging is done in the home, primarily. Typically they quote around 95% or higher of charging is actually just done in somebody's garage or, they park on the street there. So there is a lot of balance you need to think about. I would never recommend putting in chargers everywhere. I would actually highly recommend against that. I think it's just take a really balanced approach to where you might have high traffic areas or, have people that are charging up that need either quick charges or maybe here at the county, if you have somebody with an electric vehicle coming in from 40 miles away or so for work, perhaps you'd want to, allow for charging here at the county for employees too. So, thinking about the key goals of putting in a charger is always super important because you don't need them everywhere. So that's kind of the upfront portion on background and purpose. And this will really just help frame up, what you all are thinking as you move forward and kind of give some guidance and strategy to this process. Any questions?
I did mention 40 miles. What is the range?
Great question. And that's one of those, it depends responses. I know Gary was just talking about taking a Tesla over to South Dakota. I think you said. Yeah.
Falls.
Yep. And Teslas can have 400 miles. I don't know what you all.
His was a 330 mile
Okay.
range.
Yep.
basically.
Yep. And I know John was telling me about a new battery that could have up to 700, but typical, like my vehicle, it has a range of about 240 miles, so pretty high. It's the Chevy Bolt EUV, and then there are smaller ones that cost tends to follow how many miles you can get on the battery, so you can get a little bit more reasonable vehicles like the Nissan Leaf and things like that, that are around 150 miles. So depending on your needs, and how much you're driving and, how much you can charge up overnight, typically that meets a lot of folks' needs. But again, that's just, it depends on who you are and where you're driving and, thinking about
That's
your sales, and sales.
pure electric one, not a hybrid.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, it diminishes in cold weather, I believe, too, right?
Yes, they estimate around 30%, and there's still a lot of research being done. The best research is probably on the Teslas, just because they have been around longer. And also people have been testing their distances, but they estimate you lose about 30%, which is true of internal combustion vehicles as well. Your gas mileage tends to plummet in those cold days. It's just that we don't think about it in the same way because there are gas stations all over the place. So you don't have that worry, hopefully, as much. You might have that pain in the pocketbook though, that hits you when you fill up your gas tank.
When we look at these stations, we're looking at more transient travel than people that are here in our county.
I think a little bit of both.
Well, you said 95% were charging them at their home.
Yep.
Right.
Yep, but if you think I think yes, certainly for tourists and, again, I know snowmobiling's big up here, fishing and hunting and all the great amenities, beautiful drive, that we just had. And also thinking about maybe like employees could be a good target that might be driving from further away. If you do have a shorter range on your electric engine and maybe you have to go to a kid's soccer game and go to baseball and, you're kind of going all over the place, right, to do all that stuff. So it could also be for residents or thinking about folks that maybe don't have a garage or a plug outside that they'd have access to if they're, renting or, if you're in a manufactured home park or something like that, and you don't have the infrastructure yet. You could also provide it for folks that might not have the ability to put that in yet or access to that if they don't own the property as well.
And this is part of the great unknown, is that, we're all sort of on the bleeding edge of what this is, and especially being in a rural community, I think that there's some particular challenges and opportunities. So from a tourism perspective, having chargers in town would presumably be a benefit, because as more people are getting EVs, knowing that their destination has EVs would be a benefit. And while in cities, larger cities, I think people know a little bit better, or have a little better feel for who is using the EVs, the EV charging stations. I think that is a little more difficult to pin down here, because I would imagine that most people in this community, in this area, are going to be charging at home, just like you were saying. And it's sort of that emergency use. Oh, I didn't do it last night, and I have to go to the county government center, and holy cow, I've only got 20 miles left. It would sure be nice to be able to plug it in and to know that there's an EV somewhere that I can do that at. But we don't really, it's going to change. What we think we know today, 10 years from now, we're going to know a lot more. And again, the policy is about how do we go ahead and set up this sort of operation if we choose to. The policy isn't actually doing it yet. But I think that's a terrific point.
How long does it take if say we had a charger here, somebody was coming from Minneapolis and heading for Hayward, they're running out of juice. How long would they have that pump tied up to at least make it to Hayward?
Yeah, that's a great question and it depends. Unfortunately, so the earlier question around the battery, the distance you can go. So if you have a larger engine or tank, obviously like if I can go 240 miles and it took us, I think it said 150 miles about I have left in my tank. So I, still have quite a bit of juice left to go. So perhaps I don't need to go. I don't know exactly how long Hayward is from here. I know it's a couple hours.
No,
About
it's
an hour.
45 minutes,
Yeah.
hour.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I might be able to still make it to Hayward. I'd probably be right on the edge where I would get really nervous and I would stop somewhere, I'm sure.
'Cause I'm sure there's not one between here and Hayward.
Right.
Yeah,
Probably
there
is.
is some on 35 or on 35, and I know that corridor, actually 35 and 94 in Minnesota, and then 94 and 52 and 41 in Wisconsin are the kind of the prioritized corridors to put the fast charging in every 25 to 50 miles, which is great, because so the other thing, so it depends on how much juice your battery can take. And then it also depends on what type of charger you put in. So there are typically 3 different levels, level 1, 2, and 3. So level 1 is like, I could plug my car right now into just an outlet in the wall. It's just a regular outlet. It takes a long time to charge. I typically get about 2 miles an hour added to the car. So it takes forever. And most people don't do that. I do, because I just bought a house and need to invest in the infrastructure. But a level 2 is just like, your dryer is plugged into a 220 volt. Yeah.
220,
I always say
yeah.
240 accidentally. My dad would scold me. So it's 220 volt, and it's just that larger plug. And that you can get about 25 to 40 miles an hour. But again, that's more for just like, you just need a little bit. And then you go up to DC fast charging, which you could essentially get like 250 to 300 miles in an hour. So if you have a DC fast charger out there, a level 3, you could maybe juice up in 20, 30 minutes. And it depends on the vehicle too. Like the Chevy Bolt is more affordable because it's really slow at fast charging versus the Tesla. You can fast charge that thing super fast, which is why people love Tesla. But typically between like 20 to 60 minutes for a DC fast charger. And then there are multiple factors that it also depends on with like how your battery is doing, just like your cell phone, like, is your battery's health good or not, or.
So we're gonna have to have these charging stations in places where people have something to do for an hour or 2 hours or
Exactly.
3 hours. And we don't want them sitting around our courthouse for 3 hours.
Yes, you want them
But-
sitting around your
We're
restaurant.
gonna use the
and-
slot machine.
That's unique actually, is we have quite a few folks that we've seen on a regular basis that come here. There are attorneys that come out of the cities that are typically here for court and things along those lines. So it's a different clientele versus maybe the tourists at this point in time,
Yeah,
because maybe there's not as many of those coming through, but certainly those coming to do business here would possibly take advantage of it.
yeah.
But
And
you're
they're here for
absolutely
a
right
couple hours.
that having them at restaurants, at trail systems that people are gonna be utilizing, that those are gonna be really important considerations when deciding where to site them.
And typically they do say EV drivers, like, obviously they're stuck there for a little longer. They also spend more money at your businesses and shops then because of that, which typically means, you're stopping for lunch instead of buying a granola bar, a quick trip. You sit down maybe for a total lunch or something like that.
Is the higher capacity charging stations recognize what they're attached to? So that they don't, overcharge and create a hazard?
Yes. And the car also helps tell the charger what to do. And like how fast they can charge, because the car has like so many bells and whistles inside that I won't even try to understand all of that stuff that's going on, because that's, all the computer systems that are in the car and in the charger that talk to each other are in there to make sure that they don't overdo it on the car.
Put 10 gallons in a 5-gallon pail.
Right.
Essentially, yeah.
For people who have range and charging time concerns, would a plug-in hybrid be a solution for those folks?
Yeah, I love that. I mean, it took until I had access to a second vehicle for me to be able to have an electric vehicle, because I still go see my folks in Green Bay, so I go from Minneapolis to Green Bay. And so that corridor's a little sparse yet with charging, so I'm a little nervous. So we have a regular hybrid that we use for that trip so that we're not
So
in
like,
that situation.
does Toyota have a Prius as an example?
Yep. Yeah, a lot of them have hybrid, for the Fords, the Chevys, a lot of them are doing that just because also your gas mileage really shoots up. So you can see like 45 to 50 miles per gallon, which is a win for a lot of people to save some money at that gas station stop,
So I
right?
drive a Prius and it's been a really good car. It's not a plug-in Prius. And actually, so my personal bias is that the plug-in Prius isn't quite great. I'm not sure because you don't get enough battery capacity to drive very far. But a car like the Chevy Volt previous version that had the little gas engine, and you could drive 40 or 60 miles on battery, and then the little engine would charge the battery to drive the car, was sort of like the perfect combination. Because most people don't drive more than 40 to 60 miles in a day. But then you got the gas tank that you can use if you are going on a longer excursion.
Yeah. And the primary reason people don't buy electric vehicles yet, it's actually mostly because of their fear of those longer range trips. So that they're nervous about going longer distances because there isn't enough charging in these main routes, which is kind of exactly what this federal funding is meant for, to get at least the major highways, especially through the rural areas of the country, connected so that people have the opportunity to do it. Because like, if you have your own house and garage, you probably can set up a charger at home. And if you're just, driving like 60 miles a day, you can do it. But like, if you want to go visit your family, like that's the part you can't do. So that's a part of why that federal funding is targeted to those major corridors in all the states. And there will continue to be additional funding for additional corridors in all the states built out in the future. So, because that is the primary reason people are scared of electric vehicles, which is also why I didn't for so many years as well.
The Tesla then, what's the speed that they'll drive it on a hybrid? What's the?
Oh, however fast you want to go. They're truly very nice
If you go up
cars.
to 130, the model my son has is you can go 130 miles an hour. We're not going that fast. When we went out to Sioux Falls, we took it up to 80 because that's the speed limit, and it just rode really nice. It burns more energy the faster you go.
That's what I was wondering, what
Mhm.
what will the lifetime of the battery be driving at 80 miles an hour?
Oh, well, I don't know the long-term thing. I know the battery is rated, it has an 8-year warranty on the Teslas. And
But I think you mean. will it-
What's the
will it-
range if you're
will it
going 80
diminish?
miles an hour?
Oh,
Has to.
well, that was one of the things we're doing an experiment. So we went out there in the summer, beautiful day. We're gonna go again in January when it's cold, and we want to see the comparison. We went, the total trip was 607 miles. And we started off at 100%. Normally, on a day-to-day purpose, you don't charge an electric vehicle to 100%. You want to keep it around 80, 85, somewhere in that percentage. Think of a battery is like blowing up a balloon. When you first start blowing up a balloon, it's easy, but when you get towards the end, before it pops, it's a lot tougher to blow up. So you're doing the same thing with an electric battery in this sense. It's not like our cell phones because it's a different chemistry in the battery. So we started off at 100%, and then we drove it down. We got down to Marshall before we did our first little charge. And so I think at that point, we got it down to about 20% at that point. And we followed the instructions that the car was telling us to do. For our next stop in Sioux Falls, it said, well, just charge it up about 25%. We were there we were in and out in less than 10 minutes. And so then we got to Sioux Falls, we ate lunch, we charged it up again before we left. We had one more stop on the way. What was interesting about that trip was we planned out the route, but then the computer told us, because we had been going faster, you know, you're not gonna make it to where you're gonna go. This is what you should do, is pull off over this way, and then we'll route you back up to Mora, because my son lives in Mora. So we routed back up a different route, and it's looking for speed for the trip. So it deterred, instead of going through Mankato and, you know, up the interstate, it said, hey, take 169, you'll get home faster if you do it this way, and you'll make a pit stop sooner. And that's what we did.
Wow.
So it was very interesting observations of what was happening. We recorded everything down. We're gonna try to recreate it in real time, because we know we're gonna lose a little bit of distance because of the cold weather. And it's just goofy things bots do.
So that's on the Tesla.
That's on the Tesla. So, yeah,
Are you kind of a Tesla fan then?
I am, but I'm a minivan guy. I'm waiting for Chrysler to come out with their minivan. And I keep reading but good things about that. They're gonna they have a modular system, what Chrysler is doing. And so they can put different vehicles on top of this charging system. And so,
And I guess Volkswagen is coming back with the bus.
yes, we saw that too.
Yes.
I'm not there yet. But see, everybody's switching over to the Tesla plug. Before everybody was doing some other standards. SAE has a standard, but with Ford and GM and now Volvo and Mercedes-Benz, and everybody's by 2025 is gonna have this Tesla type plug. Tesla's been doing it longer. They figured all these things out long ago. And so everybody's playing catch up right now, but that's just kind of.
So it'll all be standardized then within 3
Never say
Always.
everybody is gonna do the same thing. Somebody's gonna have our system's better, they're gonna stick with it to the bitter end. But right now, the big guys have, you know, Ford, GM are going with the Tesla style plug. But there's adapters where you can use the older style plugs for the other type plugs or.
Which is wonderful because Tesla has one of the best charging networks out there. And like Chevy Bolt drivers
Yeah.
like me don't have access to it. So there's phenomenal charging for Tesla in Wausau, which would get me to my parents' house, no problem. But I don't have access to it as a Chevy Bolt driver. So once that opens up, which they are actually right now opening up some of those chargers and providing adapters for other drivers, that will also really help everybody across the country, particularly I think in rural areas, because they have the best charging network. And you really can, you know, people have done the video recordings on YouTube where you go coast to coast in all sorts of vehicles. So once you have access to that charging with Tesla, if you're a non-Tesla driver, it will be a phenomenal increase in charging infrastructure for the rest of us.
What about Toyota? Are they gonna adopt the Tesla standard?
We don't know
I don't
yet.
know, yeah.
But, you know, eventually it will consolidate sort of like a Beta Max VHS battle. And,
Because no one wants to, keep up all these different
Brent-
types of.
Brent brought up Toyota. I heard, I didn't study it at all, that they have, Toyota has ceased their R&R on electric vehicles, EVs.
I'm not sure that that's accurate because I just read an article last week about their new battery that they're claiming, which I think a little bit of this is hype, frankly, where they're claiming 700 miles and full charging in 10 minutes. And I just don't think you can get that much electricity through a port that quickly. So I'm not sure that they have done that.
Research and development is what I meant. I
Yeah.
said R&R.
We could all use
Taking a
them.
nap
We
while
could
you're-
all use smart
What does stop and go to batteries? Is it-
It's actually like for me, for city driving, if it's like,
Yeah.
you're going 30 to 40 and then going to stop signs, I actually get better mileage in that regard. Because when you brake, it does this thing called regenerative braking. So then it actually recharges the battery as you brake. So actually stopping and starting is not super hard on a vehicle or on an electric vehicle if you have regen.
I think they use capacitors that they use to get you started, so that you're not doing a huge electrical draw out of the battery immediately,
Unless you want to.
unless you want to.
It does it. It will zip, it will go.
I did hear that one of the Minnesota school bus operators had some buses that were all electric. I was just wondering, stop and go, drop and stop and go.
Yeah, those have been really interesting pilots. I know, like the Met Council in Minneapolis, St. Paul has done that, and a lot of funding has gone towards electrification of school buses as well. And that's kind of a whole different, they don't use like what a traditional passenger vehicle uses for charging. But those batteries tend to be pretty large, and then they, it's also kind of like this police vehicle that they have, they're planning them. So, if they're out for service for, 6 hours or so, and then they swap out with somebody else, they can charge for a couple hours. So they have to do that sort of planning, but that's typically what these bus providers do anyways. And especially for school buses, it's kind of a good fit because they're going in the morning and the afternoon typically. So they do have a couple hour window in the middle of the day and, before and after their shift to charge up. So it does tend to be a pretty good use because they've been testing this stuff over in Europe for a while too. So we're kind of adapting all their great learnings to pull them over here. So there is a lot of grant funding as well. Should the county or the school district be interested in that, eventually we can certainly keep you in mind to send you the opportunities when grant funding pops up, because I know that helps defer some of the costs.
Do these have do you have to have special wiring, or can it just be tapped into our outlet? Say we wanted to put one out here and we have an outside plug-in, can we just run a cord from there to a charging station, or does it have to be specially wired?
So it depends what you have so typically you run the wires underground, just more for safety and all of those sorts of
I
things.
mean, would it be a special wiring or?
Yes,
Yeah,
if you would want to run 240 or
higher, yeah.
480 volt out to the charging station.
And sometimes, like, if the county would have enough capacity on your electrical system and space in the circuit breakers and stuff, you could pull right off the county building. But a lot of people install a second panel that would just be for electric vehicle charging. And this is I know we're talking to the electrical providers in the county, the 3 different partners that you have, because you can sometimes get beneficial rates. Because just like, I don't know if anybody's on like time of use, if you do that
Since
program.
1990.
Yep, exactly. Like, it's kind of like that. So the utilities can say, all of a sudden, everybody flipped on their air conditioning at home. They can maybe pull the electric vehicle charging units down, pull down their capacity so that, again, your peak isn't as high. So when everybody's asking for energy, that's how big they need to build their system too, right? So if they can drop that down a little bit with using like programs like time of use and same type of thing for electric vehicles, they can do that.
Which is really good for a fleet system, because your fleet presumably will be used overnight when it's at the peak, and that's when you're doing all your charging. And it's also, from an accounting perspective, being able to say, okay, this is how much our fleet is costing us in electricity every year is really good accountability.
Nate was mentioning that with the new addition we're having, that you're already looking into having electricity portion.
So we are locating conduit underground so that we can feed wire through at the point in time. It just makes sense instead of having to rip up all the asphalt and concrete sidewalks and everything again. We're putting it in place. Conduit's cheap. And so we're going to have conduit lines run to the parking lot. That's going to be the new parking lot that will be located in front of the facility for some public facing charges. We're going to have conduit run to the existing, and will be a new pavement for the employee parking on the south side of County Road K. And then we'll also have some opportunity for the parking lot on the north side of the building that's going to be constructed as well. So again, really preparing for the future. Should the county want to move in that direction, that's part of the conversation about funding is so important, is to be able to go after funding grants. They want to see that communities are also serious about having a policy in place and having understanding that there's been some some foresight and some thinking ahead about what that looks like for the community. And so that's really where we're at today. And we know we have time, but parting some of this foundational work in place is really important, again, to access that funding. And we also know our limitations. So this is not something that Burnett County, I think we can just take on our own and do from the standpoint of building this infrastructure out. This would definitely be a public-private partnership, should we get into that in the future. This is not something that maintenance, I know, wants to maintain or to really have oversight over, because we don't understand it. It's not government. It needs to be done by the experts that do it. So we'd be looking at possibly leasing space, to a provider or something along those lines, and working with a partner at some point in the future as we develop and as the future does develop into more EV use.
Any other questions, or you want to get in the meat and the bones of the policy? All right, so the policy, so starting on page 2, kind of gets us into the specifics that we put together on the policy. And I'll just say that there is just a lot of information here. So like Jason and Nate talked about at the beginning, this is your first taste. We can certainly, take feedback after the meeting and things like that too. But the primary sections for this are location and siting, planning for electrical load, ownership structures, so like Nate was talking about, leasing or owning, fees and funding, quantity and type of charger, and then usage, installation, operations and maintenance, implementation. There's a lot of sections, apologies. Wayfinding and signage, so just thinking about where you put your signs, and then a few other sustainability measures should you be interested in including them. Again, this is a draft policy, so this is what we've put together so far, and are seeking your feedback on. So location and siting is really around, again, where you want to put these stations or consider putting these stations in the future. And thinking about what impact that'll have for like parking regulations and things like that. So a big component is just, where to put these. So Jason helped us figure out, what districts we might want to include these in as far as zoning is concerned. And we identified airport, commercial, industrial, and planned unit development as the primary districts to put this in. Considering again, the use type and who might be coming and going from those places. In this, do you have a question? No, okay, you caught my eye with you.
I just moved my hand.
I'm looking, no, just kidding. So that is kind of what, the initial locations. We also talked about, like we were mentioning earlier, like parks and things like that, where people might be parking for a few hours. Thinking about that as well. Earlier, I know we also talked about those potentially with multifamily residential, manufactured home parks, rental units, things like that, potentially locating chargers near those as well. So that's kind of the where, as far as in the county, we're thinking about putting them or planning for them. I guess we're not putting in any chargers right now, as we've mentioned. So just planning for where we may consider it or we may allow it in the future. Another big piece is ADA accessibility. So ensuring that, your charging units are accessible for all, should there be a wheelchair or something like that, somebody that needs access to these chargers. So there are some best practices that we can just pull from and just be conscious of, just like, any of your parking spaces out front. And then also just considering this a parking space. So for, county regulations and requirements as far as how many parking spaces a business or group might need to put in. And we're just saying an EV parking space shall count as one of those, required parking spaces on site. And then also considering just a few things, typically with EV chargers, they can take up a little more space in your parking lot. So just considering, the impact of that, you might lose a space or you might just have to bump them back a little bit more. And so just taking that into account so that you don't negatively impact the area should you put in EV chargers. Because I know, in one case, we actually saw a loss of 9 parking stalls because of the ADA accessibility requirements and all of the sloping requirements. So the city actually was pretty concerned about that in their parking ramp downtown. So they actually moved the charging locations about 2 blocks down to a different lot because they didn't want to lose that many spaces. There were a lot of residents and guests going into that parking ramp. So they ended up actually moving that charger, just to be conscious of that, right? Because you want to think about that too. You don't want to make this difficult to, to take out all of this parking space, if you see that being used. And then on page 3, we talked just a little bit about, public use, the goals for public use being, if it is a publicly facing charger, put that in a visible location, include some signage so people know where to find it and how to find it. And if it's more for a county owned vehicle and you're not allowing public access, you could tuck it into the maintenance facility or something like that, just to discourage public use then, or, not to advertise it quite as much so that the county vehicles have access to that all the time.
You have it in the parking area. The restrictions in that I couldn't bring my vehicle and park in that spot.
Yeah, and later in here, we do talk about that EV charging spots should be reserved for electric vehicles only. Just so you don't run into issues with that, which is why it's important to consider if you're taking away too much parking. You want to make sure, if you don't have an electric vehicle, you have somewhere to park easily so that people aren't tempted to pull in there, and making sure signage is clear, because I think this was a joke, but somebody said, green vehicles only. And so somebody with a green truck, just regular internal combustion, and they parked there, and I really can't fault them for that. That was a very confusing sign. So I wouldn't advise saying green vehicles. Okay, I got laughs out of all of you. That was fun. It's confusing though, right? All of this new technology can be really confusing. Any other questions, thoughts?
Another meeting.
So the second section is around planning for electrical load. So this is really, I know we've already talked about talking to your utility providers about this, because we just want to make sure we're working in partnership with them, so we don't put a huge, crunch on the utility provider. So, also thinking about what that means, like we've already talked about the time of use program and things like that. Just making sure that if you put in these chargers, you set it up so that you don't get charged exorbitant fees and exorbitant rates for people to have these. So that this section is really about controlling for cost and utility demand, so that it's kind of a win-win situation for everybody, so that you don't get into excess electrical demand charges and things like that. And a lot of these chargers are really smart, so they can listen to what the utility tells them. And if there's a huge peak in demand, again, when everybody turns their AC on, is typically when that is the hottest day of the year, probably 3rd of July or whatever year that we just had. The utility can talk to the electric vehicle charger and say, slow down the power rates. Like we just can't deal with you right now. Like we need electricity for the air conditioning. So it's really cool how all these systems can talk to each other, so that they can control and can also control costs, which is really important, so that you don't see that cost shoot up.
When you have these heavy duty fast chargers, then is 3-phase power necessary?
Yeah. Yeah, it's like the 40, 80 volt and 3-phase power.
Yeah.
Yeah, they pull some significant energy, which is why they're so quick.
Yeah, you think of it sort of like a water, I'm a civil engineer, so I always think in terms of water main. You need all 3 pipes going full to get that much electricity through into the battery.
Great. So that is the planning for electrical owned section. And it also has a mention around ownership structure at the end, which we typically recommend that if the county's not owning and operating the chargers, that you certainly have a separate channel or a separate meter and bill that goes to the person that's actually owning the chargers. So then you don't get charged any extra fees and rates. You can just assign that bill to that other provider as well. So like ChargePoint is one of the biggest providers out there. They've just been around for a long time. They're one of the vendors you could consider working with in the future. There's a lot of others too. But the whole next section on pages 3, 4, it might even stretch into 5, is all around how you want to set up ownership. So do you want to own them? Do you want to lease them? And I think this question really goes back to our earlier discussion of who's using them. So if it's county-owned fleet vehicles, you know, perhaps you want to consider owning them. I'm not sure. Maybe you also just want to lease them so you don't have to worry about them in the future. But there are different models to think about. There are costs to all of this. Obviously, it's, you know, no free lunch. Unfortunately, with any of this, this electric vehicle infrastructure. But I think, you know, especially for publicly facing chargers, we've kind of said that that's the preferred method for the county, just so you don't have to do as much, you know, work with it, operations and maintenance and things like that. And also you don't have to figure out what to do with it at the end of its life, that provider will just take it back and then cap off the conduit or put in a new one to upgrade it. And
I'll just add that this is another economic morass, so completely changing a million balls in the air. We don't know what it's gonna be like a year from now, because the market is just developing now. And we don't know what products people are gonna come out with, or what kind of demand there's gonna be for them. And so when we put together the this part of the policy, it's sort of about all the things you should consider when deciding between owning, leasing, leasing a space for somebody else to operate as a for-profit enterprise. And when it comes time to actually do something, you may not recognize the landscape that we were in from what it is today.
Now, would there be multiple owners?
Pardon?
Could there be multiple owners, like somebody in Siren would take the Sirens and somebody in Danbury, another company maybe, or is this gonna be all county or all non-county? I mean, can it be separated or is it all or nothing?
you can, yeah, there.
Mix and match.
Yeah, it could be any provider can come in. If the county prefers one provider, but I know typically, you know, cities and counties have to get multiple bids when they go out for that sort of stuff. So it probably would depend on the bid at the time, which as John mentioned is shifting. But typically there's a lot of different providers, I would say, in different locations. So you wouldn't have to like identify a preference for who. We kind of just laid out a few things to consider, like who pays for the utility costs, like taxes, right? Like who pays the taxes on the land if you're leasing the property.
An electric train?
I love trains. So, you know, that all those considerations can weigh in, but you don't have to pick one specific provider because that'll.
County itself could take care of the counties,
Yes,
and then throughout the county, it could be.
yes.
Yeah, at the casino, they could put.
Blows electric company.
Mhm.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah,
Or a community may decide that they're gonna lease space to a provider.
Siren did that,
Okay.
but I don't think I think they discontinued it.
yeah, a lot of businesses, like if you haven't, like, I always think of the casino here, because there's lots of both employees and then visitors coming in nearby here, so, you know, maybe they'd consider putting a couple in that, you know, they'd work with a provider, and that would just be up to the business and the tribal nation there, so they would make that determination, so the county doesn't have to have oversight on that unless there's like a safety concern, but I haven't seen that yet, and hopefully we don't see something like that.
I don't think the county would be interested in being a provider for the whole county because.
No.
Bad enough just having it around here.
Yeah,
There's no intent, there would not be the purpose at all of this. This is really looking at how do we start to facilitate, again, these for our purpose, our use, as well as on some of our public land. And how do we make sure we've got a policy in place that provides that direction? Yeah, whatever a private business wants to do, they can still do. Or just like the Village of Siren, you know, they put their charger in years ago and it's since been removed. They were a very early adopter of it. Another town or municipality could still do that.
Sounds to me that this would be something that taverns might be interested in having.
Perhaps.
People can charge their cars and.
Maybe leave them there overnight.
Time at the bar.
Yeah.
And then all our deputies would know which had the chargers, and if they were staying there for 3 hours, and they looked for that electric car as it went down the road.
No, that's a kind of a destination place, you know, and I'm thinking like out where I live, 10, 15 miles from anywhere else. One of those places might be very wise to put in a charging station on A, where there's three-phase power, you know.
Yeah, I always think of like areas you shop or spend money or eat, like, how can they keep you there longer, right? So if I have to charge for 3 hours,
But it then would
a lot of
create an
coffee or
opportunity for
something
people
else,
to
maybe.
bring electric vehicles rather than worry if they could get home, right?
Mhm.
But tourism shot
Mhm.
right there.
You said you did have an app on your phone. If you was gonna do, 30% charge in your car, how much would it cost you?
It's a good question. That's also one of those, it depends sorts of things. So typically, like if you're just at a privately held, like a charge point station, there's usually a rate for either how much time you spend there or how much power you use. It's typically one or the other. And so I think like 40 to 50 cents, 30 to 50 cents is kind of the range per minute is usually what I hear. Like, again, I haven't filled my car, so I'm really bad about knowing costs, but I know we rented a Tesla at one point and went from about 20% to 100%, and it cost about $22. So it tends to, if you go into the US government actually has a nice little tool that you can go into and look at like lifetime costs of different vehicles and compare. So it's meant to help people shop for cars and just understand like typical wear and tear and, oil and gas costs and things like that. So you can go in and look at that. And typically electric vehicles have a lower lifetime cost. And largely it's because the electricity is a little cheaper than the similar miles per gallon, like gasoline cost in your car. But yeah, so it kind of depends. It's hard to say because it also depends on like how much charge you need to add your car and what the condition of your battery is. Like Gary was saying that balloon analogy. So like the first little bit of a balloon is really hard to blow up and then it goes really quick. And then at the end, it's really hard to blow up even further to like its biggest amount. And that's exactly how a car charger works too, or a car battery works. The beginning is really slow to charge. And then all of a sudden it's just between 20 and 80, it goes boom. And then from 80 to 100% charge, it's like just kind of pushing along at the end to fill up.
But to kind of get to the other side of your question, Norman, if you're charging at home, it isn't nearly $22 to a full charge.
No.
It's because ChargePoint has access fees, profit on top of the actual electricity. Who knows what kind of a deal they're getting from the electric company? It might be good, it might be bad. And then they have to average that over a wide area. And so you're paying a whole lot more to charge it away from home than you are to charge it at home.
Yeah.
And then if you charge it off peak,
Yep.
Yeah.
you get a decent price break as well.
Yeah. You could put your vehicle on the.
Someone needs to develop a solar powered charger at home and then
That's right.
you'd be in business.
Yep.
They have started putting some, like, there's a Costco in St. Louis Park that
Yes.
has the charger above, or the solar panel above the car chargers. They don't like power the whole car or anything like that. There's no power up there, but it's pretty cool because then it also provides shade and cover in rain and snow. So I like that.
Now you mentioned a tool that the federal government has regarding what lifetime costs or whatever of vehicles.
Mhm.
Where could a person find that tool?
I can maybe just send a link to Nate and then you can send it out. I'd have to crunch my websites.
That would
Somewhere
be,
on the EPA website.
okay, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, it's a cool tool overall.
We don't have to charge more here because we gotta pay for the jail.
That's right.
I like it.
You can
You
set
could.
your own fees. That's
Yes.
actually the next section, I think, is fees and funding. You can set your own rates if you do put in public charging. You get total control of that. So, and you want to run the business model and see what you're thinking, but you know, there's kind of a big range. Some cities just charge like $3 or $6 an hour, just flat. And then some have gotten real techy. And so if they don't want you to sit there for too long and just take up that space, like if you only have 1 or 2 chargers, you don't want people sitting there for 2 days or something. Like you want to keep them moving, so you can shoot up the rate. So you could say $3 an hour, and then after 4 hours, it's $20 an hour. And like, that's just to get them out of there. Right? That's not to actually charge that much. So you can do things like that. It's similar to just how you do parking fees and things like that too. You want to, you know, incentivize that movement. And you could even shut the charger off after 2 hours of charging if you really see a lot of use. And usually it's you hear a lot of complaints possibly from people that there's always somebody at the charger and I can never get in. And I'm certain they might call the county and tell you about that eventually, should you want to consider doing something else. So that's actually one of the metrics we have for review of this policy, is if you're hearing feedback from residents and guests and things like that on the electric vehicle chargers that you may or may not put in the future. All right. So the next section is really on fees and funding. So like I said, you can set up your own rates if you put in chargers. If you have fleet vehicles, you can use things like that time of use kind of program set up so that you can really get some beneficial rates. And you can also have the chargers locked down for just fleet vehicles if that's what they're meant for. So no public person could even access them. You might need a code or something like that to unlock it. And so there'd be a couple of different, you know, thoughts about, you just mentioned kind of the earning the revenue for the county is one potential goal of what you might think about when you're setting the fees. You obviously want to cover your costs. So putting these in the first place, you know, staff time for maintenance and things like that, you'd want to boil into the cost structure as well. And then also just balancing that cost and benefit piece. Like John mentioned, sometimes it might take a lot of usage to earn back some revenue. So maybe you just leave it open to the general public for a year or two and then turn on the billing capacity at some point. And then lastly, but probably most importantly, would be the grant funding piece or any beneficial utility programs that you might have boiled into that cost. And I should mention some cities and counties have considered doing partnerships with like businesses and things like that. So using the little bit of space you have on the charger to do advertising, you can actually sell that advertising space to people. So that could be another way to bring in some funds for the county too. And or, you know, partner with businesses. So that public-private partnership piece. So that's probably a summary of this section. I don't know if you all want to go into more detail or if you're getting sick of electric vehicles here. But any questions on that piece? Okay. So quantity and type is the next section. And I think we talked a little bit about this already. This is really just around what type of charger you might want to put in. And by that, I mean, you know, the difference between level 1, level 2, and those level 3 or DC fast chargers. And typically what we see like at a county owned facility or something like that is a level 2 charger. You know, depending on if you have level 3 DC fast charging access or not around here, which I know is a little more sparse. It's a little more on the 35 corridor right now. Maybe you want to consider that, or maybe you just want to see what happens as more fast charging rolls out with the federal government too. I would not necessarily encourage fast charging just because it is a pretty costly piece of infrastructure to put in. So I think level 2 is just a nice way to add some charge to people's batteries, particularly when they're visiting, you know, your local establishments and things like that in the towns in the county. So
is the more moderate rate of charging easier on the batteries, do you think, as opposed to the fast charging, or does it not make any difference?
I think I don't think that's a huge component, but I think there's a lot of research that needs to be done because I follow a group that just everybody shares all their information about their charging. It's incredible to see just the differences. And I think it's I've heard things like Gary had mentioned, you don't typically charge to 100%. And I hear that helps battery life pretty significantly. I think just like any vehicle, not driving, not accelerating super fast or stopping super fast will also help the life of the battery, and not driving much above the speed limit, like all of these things that we all know we should be doing anyways, tend to help the battery out in the long run. So I think I haven't read anything that's indicated that, but again, this is a pretty quickly evolving space, and the batteries actually in the
Changing
cars
a lot.
out there, have changed a lot in the last decade.
And they're probably going to solid state batteries now, which if you sort of akin to having a floppy drive on your computer and a USB memory stick, where moving away from sort of a chemical reaction to a no moving parts, not perfectly apt, but the solid state batteries don't have the kind of same issues with degradation that the lithium ion ones do. And so they're talking about the first ones coming out in about 3 to 5 years now.
So in that section, we kind of talk about those level 2 chargers being the general preference for a county owned charger again, or county owned or leased charger. Again, we look at the location and determine, and then also considering 1 out of every 10 EVs chargers to be DC fast charging. And then there's a little more detail here also about the ADA accessibility guidelines, which is this is just like the federal guideline right now. So 4% of public EV parking spaces, or 1 for every 25 spaces, should be designated as accessible. So that's, I actually was on a webinar and they were talking about it, and they're like, it's more like a handicap restroom stall. So anybody can use it, but it is available should someone need the handicap accessible stall, unless you would set your parking up in a way that is also your like federally regulated ADA accessible stall. So it's a flexible stall. It's not just for handicap accessibility. It's for anyone, but it's available for handicap accessibility as well. And then so on page 7, the second bullet, or the first inset bullet with the black dot, talks about encouraging a minimum of 1 parking stall within parking lots in the C1 and I, so the commercial and industrial zoning districts, to have access to EV charging. And each parking lot larger than 25 stalls is encouraged to have 1 per 25 parking stalls have access to EV charging. And so this is encouragement. This is not a requirement. This is just encouragement, and to consider looking at this in the future. So again, we kind of put a sub bullet: consider balance of use types with volume needed support to support all uses of the space. So if this use would not be helpful, it is not required.
But it could be things like if there's a new business coming in and they're doing new construction, that we get them to put the conduits in at construction to where those stalls might be. So that in the future, if there is a demand for the EVs at their location, that they don't have to rip up their parking lot and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Typically having to like retrofit a parking lot or a parking garage is incredibly expensive. Whereas what you all are doing already is great, because if you're laying the conduit, that means you don't have to tear up the concrete or the asphalt, which is again incredibly expensive to both tear up and replace. So kind of just being planful. Conduit is cheap. That's always the shorthand that I hear, versus having to tear up all this heavy duty infrastructure. All right, and then we get a little bit more into usage, which I think I've actually talked about most of these things. Just thinking about, if you at some point want to do a public and a fleet charger, how could you set that up? But just being really clear about who can use each charging station, and considering signage for that as well. So, again, you can use learnings from any sort of parking regulations you might have in place for this, or learn as you go and consider revising any sort of guidance that you might need to make sure if you have a county fleet vehicle that's electric, they have access to those chargers if that's the priority for that charger. Then it talks a little bit about billing and just kind of tracking the usage. A lot of these systems can provide you with wonderful data around, you know, you can even look at like, is there one person that just continuously goes there, right? That like, either maybe you want to keep them moving out of the charging space, or it's just great to know you have one local resident or somebody using the charger regularly. And you can look at, you know, where are these vehicles coming from, if you can get access to, you know, their registration information, but then you can just look at how much money they're spending at the charger and how much time they're spending at the charger. And they'll give you all of that information as well. So you could even think about increasing rates at certain times if you want, or maybe decreasing rates at certain times, like overnight, if, you know, you want to allow people that are, you know, in a rental unit nearby, they could actually park there overnight then, and maybe you incentivize that because they don't have access to put in their own chargers at that home or residence. So yeah, initially the last bullet talks a little bit about initially the county doesn't anticipate putting in any of these restrictions. It's kind of a, you know, use it if it's put in. So just to encourage and incentivize, but you're set up for success to be able to change that as things go forward then. All right, and we're on the home stretch. So all of these sections are really small, but I should probably stop. Any questions on that last section or just generally? I can talk fast. Yeah.
I presume that all of these chargers are built with surge arresters, surge suppressors. So in case of a lightning strike nearby, then
Yep.
that would,
Yeah. They want to protect the chargers and the car too, I think has some technology to make sure it doesn't. Yeah.
and maybe they would have a little reset button or something like that.
Yeah. They might typically, like you do, like pay like a month or monthly or annual cost to whoever you purchase the charger from to do like billing and things like that. And they can also provide like maintenance packages should it go out on Christmas Eve or something like that. And you know, no one's around, like you don't, then the county, that's the nice part about leasing sometimes, that the county wouldn't really have any responsibility except maybe you get a call from a resident. And so then you call the charger provider and they can deal with it then at that point, which is kind of nice. But typically like a level 2 charger doesn't take a lot of maintenance. You really just have to keep snow away from it, maybe wipe down the screen once in a while to make sure, just like a car gets dirty, you know, these things get dirty. But level 3s, DC fast chargers, those take a bit more maintenance. There's some filters and things like that in them that you also have to work with.
But just to be clear, nothing is lightning proof.
Yeah.
That I don't think that we can say that if a charger got struck with lightning, that it would be damaged or put out of commission for a period of time. It might be, but I can't guarantee that.
And a lot of these would be like insured then too. So then,
Yeah.
you know, just like when I just hit a deer, it was covered under insurance, unfortunately. So, but fortunately, right? Which is why we have that store stuff. Great. So the next couple of sections talk a little bit about installation of the chargers. So this actually gets to your question a little bit. So locating them in areas to avoid damage to the technology, equipment, or other county infrastructure and assets. You know, a nod to like letting businesses or residents know if you are putting in an EV charger, kind of just like any construction project, you'd probably talk with those folks and let them know. Around operations and maintenance, the big thing is just thinking about if it's county owned, putting together, you know, or adding it to the annual maintenance planning that you already do, you know, just putting it in the rotation with anything else that's nearby to check in on it once in a while. And if it's third party owned and operating, just making sure that you're talking to them and setting that up in the contracts, you know what they're responsible for, and then you know what the county is responsible for. And the other question we get a lot is snow removal. And obviously these units, you want to be careful you're not driving snow plows too close to it or anything like that. So there typically are protective bollards. and things like that that they recommend with installation of these so that a vehicle or snowplow doesn't accidentally just run it over. But one of the more interesting examples I've seen is that they must not have talked to their public works group and things like that in this one facility specifically, because I saw a picture of wintertime, right? And there is literally just piles and piles of snow. It's like the snow mountain. That's actually where they put the snow, and that was just the habit of where they put the snow, and they had decided to put in the chargers right there. But I don't think anyone talked to Public Works about snow plowing. So just a recommendation to avoid that situation, so that, either the snow would go somewhere else or the chargers would go somewhere else, because there's no need to create that conflict if it can be planned out, and you're already doing that by having all these great staff members involved from so many different perspectives in the county. Then as far as implementation, we just talk a little bit about, new construction and renovation to consider installing either the conduit for the eventual infrastructure or the infrastructure itself. A little nod then to the earlier discussion on wayfinding and signage. So following all the county's current signage requirements in the zoning code, and thinking about how the county might want to label for electric vehicle charging. There are some best practices out there. So just if you would want to adopt one of those, that's clear it's not a green vehicle, it's an electric vehicle that can park there. So that everybody knows what's going on. And then measures that we ended with on page 9. Just considering if you do put in some EV infrastructure, to consider using renewable energy sources like the solar panels on top that you all were talking about. That's an encouragement, again, no requirement, but like John was saying, if a new business or something comes in, perhaps they take a look at this and they consider it. So no requirement there. Also thinking about, the local residents, and like we talked about earlier, if there's a lot of parking that's going to be taken away and your residents or guests use that parking, potentially considering putting those chargers elsewhere so that you don't lose 10 parking stalls or something like that in a really active area where you need that parking. And then thinking about just how, if you could use recycled material or something else. Sorry, there's trying to not hear the conversation behind me. But thinking about recycled materials, or potentially, after the chargers are put in, could you put in some nice plantings or things like that would just make the location look nice as well. So those are all at the end here are kind of more lighthearted topics, I guess, if you will, around EV charging infrastructure. So any questions, thoughts?
There will be some eventually, but for now.
No, there have been a lot, so.
Well, that's part of it, that, there is when I first started looking at EVs, I didn't know what questions to ask. And I think that as there's more conversation and more time to think about it, questions will come up. And we're happy to address any of those as you have.
Absolutely, and if the meeting wraps up anytime soon, you can come out and check out my EV if you'd like. Even we won't be driving it around to save battery, of course, but if you want to look, if you're interested in looking under the hood or whatnot, I'm happy to show that off. I have the charger in the back too if you want to see some of this, because I know it helped me bring it.
Where's your closest charging station?
Oh, I don't know where the closest is. We were gonna stop in North Branch on the way back. There's a fast charger there that has a restaurant nearby.
If you were desperate, Hinckley is probably closer, but it's the wrong direction.
Oh, is it? Okay, yeah,
Go north a little bit.
okay.
How about like Rush City or Pine City, which is between Hinckley and North Branch?
They might.
It might. So they have really cool, like Gary was talking about, there's one app that kind of just, if you tell it exactly where you're going, it says, okay, tell me how full your battery is, and then I'm gonna map you the best route. So like, they don't tell you where they all are. They kind of just tell you where you should stop based on like the amount of battery you have. So actually when we leave here, I'm gonna plug it in again and confirm that the North Branch location is in fact where we are going to stop, and that we don't.
Very
just
glad
stop
to hear
earlier.
Does it also tell you the construction?
I think it interacts with Google, so whatever Google knows, this app also knows. I should also check out construction on the way back, so if you have any tips, let me know.
When you consider EVs, you do not consider hybrids then?
No, those are typically, a lot of those aren't plug-in, even they're, they're just like the Toyota Prius and things like that. There are a few that are plug-in hybrids, that those are considered plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. But they're that quasi. And again, they're a nice match for a lot of people's driving needs and things like that right now before the infrastructure gets out there. But they are considered an electric vehicle, but if it's just hybrid, that one is not, because there's no pure electric engine on it.
I just want to hit the page 12, like, the percentage where you had there.
Yes,
That's just electric vehicles. That does not include hybrids.
yes, that's pure electric vehicles. That was registration information I pulled. So what Norman's talking about, yeah, page 11, end of page 11 and 12, it talks about just how many vehicles are in Wisconsin and in Burnett County specifically. I found the spreadsheet that had that information for 2021. So that's a little old, especially considering the news rebate that was added back. So starting in 2023, again, you can get up to $7,500 tax credit federally if you purchase an EV in 2023 or beyond for the next decade. So I would assume that that's helped accelerate. That helped me. I'm not gonna lie. That's gonna be good for my tax rate next year. But across the whole state, they did see a 40% growth from 2021 to January 2022 in electric vehicle purchases and registration in the state.
Short and sense before we
Yeah.
start the public hearing.
If I may just weigh in real quickly here. Our intent is one to really is to start thinking about a policy again, so that if the county wants to move in this direction, we have the foundation set as we start to explore options in the future. But we also know that the market is changing and changing quickly. And sometimes, we get into things and maybe we're on the leading edge of it, and perhaps the marketplace will take care of it. And there will be these that are going to be in place for, visitors and stuff like that coming to our community. I think long term, we're still going to have to think about whether or not we're going to need some for our own fleet vehicles. We know that there is probably cost effective ways of having a fleet system over the course of time, knowing that a lot of these vehicles also never leave the county. They're simply within the county. So it may make sense for us on our side, the business side of things, to be able to put some of these in place. But then again, take a look at the policy. And my hope is that within the next 2 or 3 meetings, we can hear from you folks more questions and concerns you have, whether we have that in a separate meeting or whether you filter that directly to Jason or myself. We can get clarifying answers and kind of start to build that FAQ. Might be really helpful as then we move on to infrastructure committee, ultimately admin and the full county board. But again, as a policy, this is something that we think is pretty important to continue moving forward with in the future, especially over the next 6 to 12 months.
And I would imagine there's a template out there somewhere. I'm just thinking potential zoning changes, is a permit going to be required, just so there's some oversight on.
If you folks ever want to solidify something in ordinance, absolutely. Our thoughts are is if we keep it more as a policy or a guideline or things that we can use as a lens when working through on development, again, talking about the encouragement of having some of these located as sites, depending on what the development is, makes a lot of sense. But do we want to push through an ordinance to do those things? I'm not quite sure. Burnett County's there yet. And I'm not quite sure that the community would be able to handle some of that at this point in time. Perhaps they could, but I guess those are all things for this committee as well as the county board to discuss in future months.
Regarding Tesla charging stations, have they opened up to non-Tesla vehicles yet?
They're starting to roll that out right now, yes. And I think by the end of the year or into next year, it should be completed. And you'll need a converter because the plugs are different. But yes, they will be opening all of those up. It's my understanding, at least, that is what Tesla, the company Tesla said, so.
So the non-Tesla owner would buy this adapter then and then carry it in the vehicle and.
Yeah, you just throw it in your car and have access to it. Yeah, they have a few now. They're just not like certified by Tesla. They're kind of, people that are ingenious and great at these things have figured this out.
Might be a good idea to wait.
I didn't buy one yet, I'll just say, because I'm nervous about them blowing my car up or something.
Any other questions?
So when can we do the show and tell with your car?
You're having a recess, you can certainly come out there.
We'll take a 10-minute recess now.
Well, thank you all. It was a
Yes.
pleasure meeting you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You couldn't have ordered a better day.
Right.
It's so nice. It was about 10 degrees warmer in the city, so it was a little hot.
43.
It's like a little.
Yeah, it's 59 in my house.
Yeah.
I had the windows open all night.
Oh, but how refreshing.
I forgot to check or it went lower than it was supposed to.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, it's like, it was 45 when I woke up and I
Next, the public hearing. Will Jason please read the public hearing notice?
So it's a public hearing, state of Wisconsin, County of Burnett, Tuesday, July 11, 2023 at 9 a.m. at the Burnett County Government Center, room 165, Town of Mean Siren, Wisconsin, regarding the following Burnett County Land Use Shoreline Protection Ordinances. Number one, text amendment TXT 2303, Burnett County Land Use Ordinance, Chapter 30, various agricultural related items. Public notice hereby given to all persons in Burnett County, Wisconsin, that the Land Use and Information Committee is proposing to amend Burnett County Code of Ordinances, Chapter 30, with various agricultural related items throughout the chapter. Details of the proposed revision are available at the Burnett County Land Service Department, Burnett County Clerk's Office, and on the Burnett County website.
Thank you. We want to go through it before I open the public hearing portion.
Now, why don't you open the public hearing?
Okay, I'll open the public hearing. We have no comments online. Any comments on the building? If not, we'll close the public hearing. Go through it.
All right, so we're gonna go through it word by word. Keep you here till 4. No, I'm kidding.
We do have health and community services at 1:30.
You do? All right, we should be here till 1:25.
Why should we be the only ones who have to stop?
Exactly.
To print and law.
Yes.
This was something we had prepared, what, was it 2 years ago? And it's on the verge of taking it to county board. And we got a letter from the Department of Ag that basically questioned whether that this would be compliant under the statute. So we pulled it back to county board and to investigate that further. We went through this with, and it wasn't that we couldn't do it, by the way. They would not say we couldn't do it. They just said, you know, we don't know that it would hold up under the language of the siting law. What we're talking about is the capping of animal units in certain ag districts. That was the element. The rest of it, not controversial. At the time, our consultant believed we were correctly with that, and now he's told us he's even more confident now that the plain language of the law enables us to do this limitation, so long as we don't eliminate entirely an ag district that is not capped with animal units. And our rationale of using the existing A district to be uncapped is because that is where one would expect a larger operation to be. And majority, that's 30,000 acres approximately. And A2 is 130,000 acres in Burnett County, which is A2 as without a specific overlay for farmland preservation does not meet ag standards because it allows too much other stuff. It's pretty evident that A2 is an appropriate district to have. To maintain a lighter use, mixed use kind of thing. And so as we believed, as the recommendation came from the large scale livestock siting committee to make those changes back when we had that going, we're just continuing with that process. But I think that's all I really have to add to it. There's a couple of little changes we do need to make. We referenced chapter 18 for odor offset. I think we're going to have to modify that language because there isn't any provision currently going. And Sean can help me with this, but we don't have provisions for odor offset at this point. So I think we'd want to change that phrase to reserve for future setback initiatives from chapter 18, which is the health section where the siting ordinance, the manure management ordinance, and the operation ordinance will all be. But it won't be in the siting ordinance. So, but it'll all fall into that chapter. But where it'll be exactly, we do not know. So that's the only thing I came upon that we need to amend slightly to just reserve that section for chapter 18 amendments coming on down the road. Sean, do you think there ever will actually be a specific odor offset?
That's hard to say at the time. I don't feel like yet we have the definitive I guess, structure on how to limit that any more than just state requirements.
At the time we were writing this, the state was contemplating that too, and that is no longer in the table for them either. So in the interest of not saying we're gonna do something that we don't know we're going to do, we want to change that language, I believe. Do you see anything else, Sean, in your read through this stuff?
I haven't.
Okay, that's all I will add to the discussion for now.
All right, so we'll just, I guess, try to fly through here a little bit. Just look at the items where I had highlights. Page 4. We changed the definition of facility. A lot of this stuff is minor, kind of house cleaning, housekeeping stuff. Page 9, we're eliminating the A1 district. I don't think Craig mentioned that in your little brief discussion, but A1, there's only 600 acres maybe in the county. By definition, it's supposed to be a district that adjoins urban area because it's supposed to be an ag urban transition. The 600 acres that exist is in the town of Rusk, which we can't even figure out why that's considered urban transition area. There's nothing out in Rusk.
Farther from an urban area, it's still.
Right.
Yeah, so I think so we are just decided to eliminate the district since there's so little of it. Why have another district floating out there? That doesn't make sense.
My only question is, should the numbers in that table then change if you're eliminating numbers?
No, I don't think we want to change. Everybody's so used to A2 and what it means and what the.
Oh, no,
definition-
not those, just the numbers listing on the side.
Oh, the 6, 7, 8, 9.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would probably change. Muni code will catch that for
Okay,
us when they renumber the
Good
section.
catch though.
Yeah.
Right.
The number of those.
That's the only page I read, by the way.
Here, what else we got? Page 12. So this is in the A district. Changing a few housekeeping things there. Really nothing else.
Some of the language in this draft that we adopted back in 2007, I think, or so. Had some kind of archaic language about essentially when farm workers needed to be housed and they had essentially a manufactured home, mobile home community permitted in an ag district. And that probably hasn't been the case for really quite a long time. Tried to clean up some of that stuff too.
Yeah.
And then we kind of reconstructed our ordinance. Used to be based on a kind of an A2 and a narrative of things that could be not in the conditional use, and we enumerated them to match up with the A district. There's some cleanup of that sort.
Yeah.
So the things are done differently, but are essentially the same.
And then page 13. So this would be the change we'd want to make on line 34. We would, right now it says for farms with more than 250 animal units, additional setbacks for odor offsets must meet the standards in chapter 18. I think what we would just do then is strike the additional setbacks for odor offsets. So then you would just say for farms, they'd have to must meet the standards in 18. That way, if odor offsets ever go into 18,
Yeah, exactly.
it would cover it.
It's just whatever would work as a clean up there.
So we'll make that little minor change. Yeah, page 14, that's where we start enumerating. And on to 15. Instead of it being a paragraph, page 16, that's where we're striking, and 17, striking A1. Page 18, now this is an A2, so this is where we're gonna limit the number of animal units. That you cannot exceed 500 in A2. Enumerating again.
And I should add, we maintained the conditional use permits from 250 on up.
Yep.
Because otherwise we're gonna leave a void below 500 where we weren't going to scrutinize anything.
Mhm.
essentially. And again, we wanted to maintain conditional use permit to review as we kick up above 250.
Yep.
And then we hit 500, we fall under the citing ordinance. And
Yeah.
John can, if you have a question about how that works. But that's again following the statutory provisions for citing.
So in essence, you go from 0 to 250, you don't have much regulation other than like manure management and things like that. And then 250 to 500, you have conditional use. And then 500 and over, you'd fall under citing rules and all those things. And then once you're at 1,000, then your KFO status, and then a bunch of other state rules kick in as well. 19, again, just enumeration, cleanup. 20, same thing, enumerating items. 21, same thing.
And Jason on 19 again,
Yeah.
number 11, everywhere we have that, we'll be striking that.
Was that on that one too?
Yeah.
Oh, yep.
It'll appear in A2 and in A4 as well.
So we'll strike that, the odor offsets. Page 19. Also do the strike the odor offsets on page 21. Let's see, 22, 23. Page 27, striking the exclusive ag out of forestry.
Yeah, that was the provisions for ag and forestry had something to do with farmland preservation
Yeah.
acres, I believe.
Yeah.
And it kind of didn't make sense to us when we discovered it.
Yeah, I don't know why we'd want a giant farm in a forestry district, but yeah, what else we got on here? Farmland preservation overlay, so page 33. Essentially just, again, enumerated the items instead of it being a paragraph format. Table on page 36, struck out A1. And we'd probably go a long ways because this is all other fun ordinance stuff. Table on page 61. 62, had to strike A1 out of there. Page 65, again, striking A1 in spots. So yeah, the meat of everything we did was in the first couple pages there. Yes, probably. I think that's it.
I don't think I did anything more here.
So we would make those couple minor changes to the odor. 3 odor references.
Right. Yes. Until we have an order, we've said we ought not to talk about it.
Yeah.
Interestingly, Minnesota and Iowa have that, but for some reason we don't.
Yeah.
Wish to make a motion to send this to county board.
So move.
Motion by Mr. Anderson.
Bring him in.
And by Mr. Eden. We're gonna have a roll call. Mr. Sheminski. Yes. Mr. Blomberg.
Yes.
Ms. Anderson.
Yes.
Mr. Anderson.
Yes.
Mr. Eden.
Yes.
Mr. Conroy,
Yes.
Mr. Bickford, yes.
All right, so that'll be on the agenda on county board, whatever day, the 20th or something, 22nd. I won't be here. I'm sure Craig can handle.
I
Any
can,
comments?
argue it if anybody
Yep.
wants to argue about it.
Yeah,
And we will be bringing the siting ordinance initial. There'll be 3 phases to that: siting, manure management, and operations. Not the right order, it'll be operations and then manure management.
Probably gonna go in that order. So,
Okay. And those will be coming incrementally, but citing is first, be much shorter than the current ordinance. Because again, we've been advised that citing should just be citing. And then those other things give us more latitude and more flexibility outside of citing. So that's why we, and again, jump in anytime I misstate something.
you're doing great.
But anyway, so that will be done on Thursday. So we'll take both citing and our text amendments to county board at one spell swoop, as it were.
That'll come through natural resources then.
Yes.
Yes.
yep, natural resources on Thursday has
It's been a
that.
long time of brewing, as they say, but we finally got her done.
Mhm.
Next.
All right.
Land services.
My reports are in there, nothing too exciting. Budget reports in there again. Everything's roughly on track for this year, nothing, no expenses out of line. Website statistics, again, you're at that 325 users per day. About 100 per day on the weekends, put in there the countries. Permit numbers. Other than that, not much else. Things are plugging along.
We had a pretty consistent pace.
Yeah, I'm surprised. Usually we get a lull in July, but it's been pretty busy still. I mean, the phone, a lot of people coming in and
Maybe it's more sustained instead of the peak and valley.
Yeah.
Peak, you know, it's just gonna catch up to anyway by
Yeah.
steady.
yeah,
Well, I understand that out at the. But it has nothing to do with anything, but that when they tore down that cabin out in Meyer Lake to rebuild what they could legally do,
yeah,
which made a heck of a lot more sense than scabbing onto the old one, I guess.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
just heard that last night at the meeting.
yeah. Yeah, so I'm off the last 2 weeks of July. I am gonna be checking emails though, so you'll still be, if I get, public comment, however, I think I've already sent you guys all the stuff for August.
Yeah.
You'll see there's a pretty decent amount of things. The first one is actually gonna be postponed, that Borg one. Oakland wants it postponed for a month, so I'll tell them, usually you guys postpone it if they request it, the storage unit one. So you'll still have 7 on the agenda for August.
But that'll eventually come to us.
Yeah, that'll probably be on your September agenda. Push back a month.
What? You know what, I had a question. West.
Who's the Rusk one?
An overnight.
Oh, you talked about
Let me look them up here.
retreat or something.
Oh, yes, the big house out there. Yeah, the wellness and craft retreats.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's gonna be a.
it's gonna be a short-term rental too. Yeah.
They will have to have a state permit.
Yep, they know that. They're actually, it's a new owner of that property. We've actually found a whole bunch of violations out there from the prior owner, and they've been really good about working with us to try to get them corrected and things, so. I think they'll be doing the right thing.
That's everything I had.
Yeah, they shouldn't, knock on wood, and none of them really are too controversial, so shouldn't have
You
any.
never know. but I
Yes.
didn't see anything too
Yeah,
much.
yeah.
Are there limitations, either state, county, or I suppose it's town to town? you know, like how many days per year and length of stay. And I'd just been at some meetings in Polk and those were some of the things that they were discussing and I didn't know if there's you know,
There is some, like, you don't have to have, you're not considered a short-term rental if you rent for less than 10 total days per year. So there is that number in statute. Most places rent more than 10 days per year. I want to say there's like 180-day number,
Yeah, it sounds
something
right
in
to me, like
statute.
6 months nominally.
Yeah, or something, but I don't know. And even, and I think when we looked at regulating short-term rentals, you know, how do you even monitor that? That somebody, if you put some sort of, I think in the past, we put CUP, like couldn't rent for more than 90 days or something a year. Well, how do you even monitor and
Yeah,
enforce
neighbors
that?
are the ones who do the monitoring.
Yeah, and so trying to put those caps on there, I mean, maybe it's a good idea, but it's almost impossible to regulate.
hard to regulate, but if they're in place, is there a potential? It's like, okay, then your permit gets pulled.
Yeah, but you gotta prove it.
That's
I
the-
can't just prove it. I can't just pull a permit. Cause I think you're over, I better have some evidence. So you're gonna rely on a neighbor to testify that, yes, I swear that they were renting over that days, and then how do you prove that
Unless
that family wasn't just friends that they had over for the week and don't count towards the number of renters? And
And that would always.
that was what people did to us too all the time. Oh, those aren't renters, they're my cousins.
And I
They don't
think
count.
unless it's through one of those sites, because I think there are, if they're using a Airbnb site, that
If
there's
to a
some,
certain extent, it was when they were renting at all before there was permission, the statutory revision, then we would have some basis for neighbors complaining or taking pictures and running plates and various things to show, that clearly that these are not the people who own the place here, right? We could argue that, but it's harder now because there's provisions for it and licensing, and it's effectively a permitted use.
Yep.
We're just glad that they got a permit in license.
Pretty much. I mean, and for the most part, we haven't heard a whole lot of complaining from the neighbors on most of the places. So I don't know if we're just maybe in a good luck
Yeah.
stretch here or something, because it does go the other way sometimes where you're constantly hearing complaints.
I think
But
the ones we heard about in the past before the was provided for were the most egregious.
yeah,
People parking and blocking the road, and
yeah,
the one we had on the peninsula of North Sand is notorious because there'd be a
yeah.
whole bunch of cars there, noise, fireworks.
That
whatever.
guy's still doing his thing without permits, but yeah,
Yeah, I mean, those were the hard ones.
yeah.
And then you'd hear about it.
Mhm.
And the ones that were pretty innocuous, nobody knew.
Yeah.
so. I think this was a discussion at a previous meeting. A house that is, set up to sleep 8. And that they're renting it out, advertising that it sleeps 20, like what happens in that situation?
We send a letter and
Okay.
an email and contact them. Now, it's unfortunate that I've done that on Airbnb. They have a spot where you can like report an issue with this property. I've done that a few times where I've typed in, I'm like, hey, I'm the zoning guy from this county. I know this place doesn't have a permit. And I never hear back from them. I was kind of hoping that Airbnb or those things would maybe help us if we flagged it, that they would do something, but nothing happens in their end. So it's all onto us to, send the owner a letter. Then we'll screenshot the rentals and the reviews, because then, I stayed there in June of 23, then we know they rented it, So that's how we try to catch it, but yeah.
I think with our contract with local gov, that a lot of that will be taken care of.
Yeah, I think that we're gonna try to set up a group or something that would kind of be like an enforcement.
That local gov is doing that, and then the townships are putting together, they're gonna have, hopefully, the ones that get in on it will put one a person on this commission,
Yep.
and they'll be in charge of looking at enforcement, looking at where the money's going, and
Yeah.
all that stuff.
Just from the town of Jackson last night, you know, they're not opposed to it or anything, but they're hovering because they're worried about the capacity for enforcement. If they adopt something, you want to be confident that meaningful enforcement will happen. That won't fall to them
Yep.
without anybody who can do it.
Yep.
right?
And
And
that's where that second part of the commission comes in, and the contract with local go.
That's what the sales pitch is gonna be to get them on board, I think. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so the county would still do go after them, and so I think it would help then if if that commission was set up and they. We hit the people from two angles, maybe then they'll get serious about getting permits and.
It may be
Plus,
that
that commission can go to to our contractor with local gov, and then they'll put pressure on the Airbnbs or
That would
BBRs.
be meaningful if it wasn't just a one person thing,
Yeah.
but we as an organization policing this. Have a whole bunch of things that are in violation and you need to take care of that. That might provide more leverage to do that.
And I've talked to the tourism commission, we're obviously sharing lists and different things back and forth, so.
Getting closer.
I'll pass it on to Jackson next time I go in that. There looks to be an opportunity. I kind of vaguely referred to it. I didn't know enough about it to advocate it.
There's two parts to this. One is the ordinance and one is the formation of this commission. And anyone that wants to know what the ordinance has the opportunity to put a person on this commission. So there'd be a person for
Yeah,
each
I think that's what they,
municipality.
using Jackson as an example, I think that's what they need to understand. That if they go get on board, then there will be a mechanism to enforce it. That they would have representation on, but would not have to do it themselves. That's what they need to know.
So they have representation, but it would also be there'd also be an enforcement piece of it.
The commission would be the enforcement
Yeah.
arm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, but again, what they're concerned about is that we have adopted an ordinance. We're trying to enforce it, but we can't enforce it because we don't have.
Yeah, we can, the town can adopt all the ordinances they want, but if nobody's there to enforce it, it does no good.
Exactly, and that's what they're hearing, and they makes them reluctant to take the next step because you don't want to get caught, having to reverse themselves.
Anything else? Things come up for August.
Oh, we'll have budget on the agenda too. So we'd have budget and then like 7 public hearing items, I think.
We'll be doing a plan committee meeting the day before too.
Yes.
Jason's gonna be an exceedingly busy person when he
The
gets.
day I come back, yeah, get another 4-hour meeting right
We haven't
away.
gone through the land use section and the intergovernmental cooperation parts yet. You have to do that. I'm thinking that'll be.
Yeah, it shouldn't be too bad.
Needed plan.
Hopefully 2 hours. We'll get it done.
Are there any large or unusual budget items that are being considered? Good.
Typical operations, maybe a couple computers or something that need to be replaced. Yep.
Well, but the volume of business, income and expense are probably not that far off.
No.
It was always the beauty of zoning in a way that took in about as much money as it could possibly be.
Anything else? Board of Adjustments calendar. This month.
No, they just met last month, so next month they'll have the North Camp and that'll be after your next meeting, because there'll be August. The appeal.
To the Board of Adjustment for.
Your motion that you felt the campground was not meeting condition 1, that decision has now been appealed to the Board of Adjustment.
That's the one up at the old Rosenthal.
No, in that regard, question about that, I knew I was gonna ask Adrian something the other day, and I remembered.
That's what it was.
Yeah, which is, he provided guidance to us on the draft of the agreement. that
Yep.
we Signed with.
Yep.
So the question then is, can he represent the Board of Adjustment now in that? As opposed to, in other words, when the lawyering.
Probably
uptime-
not.
Lawyering uptime starts, if Dave is there, is he representing us or the board POA? And we have a conflict because he was involved in the settlement discussion. Board of BOA, you know, if not, if they come, in other words, if North Camp comes to the BOA armed with their attorney,
Which they will.
which they will, we should be armed with one of our own too, probably,
Which we won't.
probably not.
The board will wing it on their own.
But I just, raising the question is that Dave probably can't.
No, he wouldn't be
He'd
able
have
to
to recuse
represent them.
himself because he would have a conflict of interest.
No, he can't represent both committees on the same issue.
No, he already represented the
Yep.
land use committee once on this issue.
You ever show up at any of those board adjustments?
He shows up if we beg and plead him to show up, yes.
I'm not unduly concerned about this if we're not represented because it would be appealed. If it goes contrary to our decision anyway. And Lassard has already been decided, which is the seminal on this thing. If we have case law, in other words, supporting what we did, that was a previous Burnett County decision. I went to the appellate court. The committee was found to be correct in an almost identical kind of decision. So.
We wish to make a motion to adjourn. Mr. Anderson.
Second.
Second by Mr. Peter. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Carried.
Anyway, we're
I'll
out.
shut off.
Exactly the same time, 121.